Hello and welcome to Skills and Automation. My name is Ash and today we're going to go through another session on useful code where we look at code snippets to tackle real life problems. Our main topic of interest is how to copy and manipulate data using arrays. I've used these techniques many times over and over again, from building dynamic reports to reconciling large data sets. While some of the code covered here might get a bit complex, all you really need to know to follow along are a for loop, ranges, and I will add another point. We would need a bit of an attempt to picture our data set in our mind. I'll make this clear soon. What we're really going to do in this session is replace the for loop and range with an array. And why would we do that? Firstly, for speed. As your data set increases, the efficiency of an array fast outpaces that of a for loop over the worksheet data. And secondly, the immense power to manipulate large data sets. Before we move further, let's briefly look at the layout of this video so that you are aware of what's coming. We will start with a demo where we look at the arrays in action. We will also look at the worksheet layouts, which are designed in such a way so that the front-end user has control over the manipulation of data. Then we'll talk about the steps that we will take to achieve the final output. I've included this part to diffuse the complexity of the final code. Finally, we'll get to actually building the code. So please feel free to skip directly to the code if that's what you're after. Let's start by looking at the worksheet data. We can see here that we have an input sheet, an output sheet, a mapping sheet, and a sheet named group. Let's start with the input sheet. This is our sales data based on invoice lines. We have around 70,000 lines of data. Our goal is to extract only the relevant columns onto another worksheet. Intention would probably be to create a streamlined data set for our revenue reporting. Just for visual purpose, I've highlighted the headings of the columns that we want to transfer over in yellow. So these are the columns that we want to transfer over to the output sheet. Let's head over to the output sheet. The headings of the columns that we're getting over from the input sheet are highlighted here in yellow. One thing to note is that the column headings don't match. For example, product in the input sheet is called SKU in the output sheet. Lastly, I've highlighted two columns, product group and product subgroup, that do not come from the input sheet in red. Rather, we will source them from the group sheet out here. And these groupings will be based on the product code. Next, let's inspect the mapping sheet. This is designed so that the end user can update how we copy data from the input to the output sheet if the columns in the original data set ever change. Let's just highlight these two out here. So for example, the invoice date, which is column 2 in the input sheet, so you can see out here, it's column number 2. This column will be called sale date in the output sheet and its position will be column number 4. If the columns in the input sheet change, the user can come here and update the new positions of the equivalent columns in the output sheet. That way, once you've built the code, you can be hands off. We will see this in action in just a bit. Okay, let's delete the contents in the output sheet and let's Alt F11 to the VBA editor. We have our final code right here. Let's run this and let's head back to the output sheet. And great, we have the data in the right columns in the output sheet, but we are not done yet. This code is designed so that the front end user can update the mapping tables if the original data set changes. So let's add one more column to the input sheet. Just going to add another column out here. You can call it anything. I'm just going to call it taxable. Just give everything a value of 1. So now we can see that the original data set has kind of moved. The columns that we are after are not in the right place anymore. Let's go to our code, run this and see what we get. Okay, there is an error. It says that there is a mismatch on the column taxable. Great. Now we want to fix this without actually going to the code. So let's go to our mapping table. The taxable column is right before the product column. So just right here, we'll add a new column, paste in the column header. These are just the column positions in the original data set. This is just for our purpose, so we really don't need to update this, but let's just do it for our reference. The code is actually just referring to the 4th column out here. So all this data is just for our reference. Okay, so we've added the taxable column. Go back to our code, run it, and come back to the output sheet. Great. The output sheet has populated correctly and everything is still in the right columns. And finally, one more error handling. The value of the groups and subgroups is coming from the group sheet. But what if we have a new product that's not yet included in this group table? Let's check that out. Come to our input sheet. Let's just change the value of one product. Let's call this spicy relish. So this product is not mapped in our group sheet, and there should be no mapping that comes in the output sheet in these two columns. Okay, let's run the macro. And the code that we added is right here. The product group and the product subgroup column both have the values as unmapped. And if we want to add a mapping, the user can simply go to the group table and add the new values at the bottom. So let's do that. Copy this new code, bring it down here. So this is relish and condiments. Paste that. So now the mapping is updated. Let's run the code again. Come back to our output sheet. So this is our line. And now we can see that the product group has condiments and the product subgroup has relish. So this is a real handy piece of dynamic code where the user can fix mapping errors themselves, and you, as the developer, don't need to have to constantly maintain it. Let's move on and discuss our approach to building this code. Arrays is a big topic, but for this video, we'll just think of them as a virtual holding space for data. So on a high level, what we're going to do is copy data from the worksheet and dump it straight into a virtual table or an array. Next, we'll perform some manipulations while the data is still held in memory. You can see out here that the columns are being remapped from two virtual tables, and we're producing one final output virtual table or a final output array. And once all the operations are performed, we will dump all the results back onto our worksheet. So the major difference between using a for loop here and an array is that in the for loop, all the operations are performed over the actual worksheet, and we would need to iterate through each cell one at a time. And this creates a major lag in speed, especially as the size of the data set increases. In an array, all operations are performed in memory and at a much faster rate, which gives us the flexibility to do so much more. So at the start of the video, I said that all you really need to know to follow along is for loops and ranges. Let's quickly look at a traditional for loop over a physical range of data in Excel and transition the same approach to that of an array. We have a data set here with 5 rows and 7 columns. To iterate through this using a for loop, we can first declare our iteration or counter variable that will allow us to move from one row to the next within the loop. For the actual loop, we will start from the second row, since we are avoiding headers, through to the 6th row. Now, each time we're on a row in the for loop, what if we also want to move from the first to the last column along that row? For this, we will need another for loop. But first, let's declare another iteration variable and then create a second for loop within the first loop, or in other words, a nested for loop. And we can print each cell in the range by referring to the current position of the cell using the I and j variables, which represent the current row and current column. In dynamic data sets, the last row is usually not known. In that case, we could use a variable to find the last row and a variable to find the last column and use that within our loop. So let's adopt the same approach to an array. First, we declare an array as a variant so that it can hold any data value. Next, we will dump the entire contents of the range into that array. Now, we have a virtual table and we can move through it in pretty much the same way. In fact, the basic for loop remains the same. So if you want to start from the top row of our virtual table, we'll call it the lower bound of the array. Notice the one which represents the first dimension, which is nothing but our rows. And if we want to specify the last row in our virtual table, we will call it the upper bound of the array. Similarly, we will use the upper and lower bounds to loop through the columns. Notice the two, which represents the second dimension, which is our columns. And lastly, if we want to print the value of our current position in the virtual table of the array, the cursor using the I and j or the row and the column variables will remain the same. We will just replace the cells object with the array. And that was a quick mini tutorial on arrays to get you up to speed with the code that will be used in this video. Now, let's look at the detailed actual approach that we are going to follow. We will dump the entire input worksheet data into an array, and this is unbelievably super easy. This is our high-level formula for doing that. Next, we define the size of the output array to be equal to the same size of the input array. So the output array will have the same number of rows as the input array and the same number of total columns as the input array. And in more technical terms, the total rows is basically the upper bound of the input array in the first dimension and the upper bound of the input array in the second dimension, which is the columns in our case. Then we will dump the entire mapping table into an array. You can see the pattern here. We're transferring everything into an array. And now for the tricky part. Next, what we're going to do is transfer the values from the input array into the output array based on the positions in the mapping array. So for every value in the input array, we will ask the question, what is the position of the equivalent column in the mapping array? If the position is not 0, then we will assign the current value to this non-zero position in the output array. I know, if we had to rank the most confusing statement in this video, then this would be number 1. But let's look at an example. The customer is in the 4th column in the input worksheet, and in the output worksheet, it is in the 7th column, and our mapping table reflects that. The second row has the position of the input sheet, and the 4th row has a corresponding position in the output sheet. And our logic will read this, and it will know to map the 4th column of the input sheet to the 7th column of the output sheet. If this is still vague, hopefully it will get clearer once we start our coding session. Besides, you can always look at the video again or review the code on our website. Okay, we aren't done yet. We still need to get the groups and the subgroups for the products. For this, we will dump all the data from the group sheet into an array. Of course we will. And then for each product in the newly populated output array, we will find the corresponding group and subgroups in the group array. This is very much like a VLOOKUP. And lastly, we will dump the final output array onto the output worksheet. Okay, I hope that's not too confusing. Let's now start building the code, which will clear away some more doubts. First, let's cover the basics of copying and pasting using an array. Let's create a new sub here. Let's clear out the output sheet. So we're going to copy data from the input sheet. If you had to copy and paste data using a range, first you would copy the range. We're just going to copy the current region of cell A1 and paste it directly into the destination location, which is the output sheet. We don't need to specify the entire data range, just the first cell in the range would do. Okay, let's delete this data, run the macro, go to our output sheet, and great. All the data from the input sheet has copied over to the output sheet. Now, let's try the same thing using an array. Comment this out. When using an array, we first need to declare the array. We will just declare it as a variant so that it can hold any value. And we'll assign the entire input range to that array. So it's basically the current region for cell A1 and dot value. And for the pasting step, we will assign the array to the entire destination range. One big distinction is that we need to define the entire range where we want to paste the data. So the first cell in the destination data range is cell A1. And now we'll resize this range to match the size of the array that we have just copied the data into. So resize, it will equal to the total number of rows in the array and the total number of columns in the array. And equal to the array. Let's run this. And we pretty much get the same result. This might seem like a few more steps, but this is a far more efficient and faster way to copy data than the range copy method. Okay, let's get to the actual coding. Create a new sub. Next, let's clear out the contents on the output sheet. If there is no input data, or rather no data other than the heading in the input sheet, then we will exit the sub. So we are checking if there is any value in cell E2, which is on the second row, which is where the body of the data starts. We'll just output a very basic message and exit the sub. Now let's declare our arrays. There are 6 arrays in total. First, let's declare an array to dump data from the input sheet. Then an array for the final output. Next, an array for the mapping data and grouping data. And we can create 2 more arrays, one each for the header of the input and output sheet. Now let's populate the arrays. First up is the input array. Normally, we could just dump the entire current region into an array, but we need to keep the header and the body separate. So we can start by finding the bottommost row and the rightmost column and use it to define the exact size of the array. Let's dim 2 variables to hold the position of the last row and the last column. Let's find the bottommost row with data first. So here we are going to go to the very bottom of the Excel sheet and then control up to the last data row, which is basically end Excel up. And we'll use a similar technique to find the last column. So we'll go to the extreme right of our data set and then control back to the left to find the last year's column. Okay, now let's fill the header array first. So the range is from the first cell in the first row to the last column variable in the first row. And let's fill in our data array. So the range here is the first cell in the second row to the cell that holds the last row variable and the last column variable. We could have done this via range resize, but I just prefer this method. Now that we have the size of the input data array, we can use it to define the size of the output data array. So let's redefine our output array. In the first dimension, it will equal to the total rows as in the input array. And in the second dimension, it will equal to the total columns of the input array. Similar to the input array, let's populate the group array. Let's copy these rows over and this last assignment as well. And we'll just replace in with group. Make sure that we have selected text and replace all. Okay, good. Okay, 2 more arrays to go. Let's mix it up a bit here. For the output array, which we have saved in row 6 of the mapping sheet, let's find the address of the rightmost populated cell in the same row. Let's dim a variable to hold the address of the cell. So visually, we want to capture this data, which is the output header. We will start from row A6 and control right to the last populated cell, which is G6. So we start from A6 and control right. And we would have reached the rightmost cell and we'll grab its address. And now we can populate the output header array. So going from A6 to G6, which is basically stored in the variable SL. And lastly, for the map array, you will just dump the entire current region of cell A1 into the array. So this is what we are putting into the array, and the current region is basically Control A, this entire range. Okay, so we just saw 3 ways to populate a dynamic array. Now let's move on to the logic. First, we will check if the original data set is in a different format than what we have mapped. I'm just going to admit here that we will not cover all the error handling scenarios in this video. Rather, we will just stick to all the code that relates to array manipulations. Okay, so we have the original header in the mapping sheet, and this is stored in the first row of the mapping array. So we can just compare each value of the input header, which is this, versus the first row of the mapping array. If there is a discrepancy, that means the data set has changed and we can exit the sub. We'll dim an iteration variable. In the array, we'll move across the columns of the array, which means we will move in the second dimension of the array from the leftmost point to the rightmost point. Let's build that loop. So we'll go from the lowest column number to the highest column number. The lowest column number is the lower bound. To the upper bound. If the current value in the header array does not match the corresponding value in the mapping array, then we will just message a mismatch error and exit the sub. Next, we can copy the output header array onto the first row of the output sheet. So visually, we're going to copy this and paste it up here. While pasting data from arrays, we always need to define the entire destination range. So this will be the first cell in the first row. To the last cell in the first row, which has the same position as the total columns in the output header array. Now for the tricky part. This is where we assign the right column from the input array to the right column in the output array based on the mapping in the fourth row of the mapping array. So this is the fourth row of the mapping array. It contains only the relevant columns which need to be pasted from the input array, and it contains information as to where to take the data from the input array and in what position to paste it in the output array. We will create an outer and an inner loop for the input array. So we need another iteration variable. We can also create a variable to store the value of the position of the column in the output array. Now let's create our 2 loops. The first outer loop will move from the top to the bottom row. So figuratively, we will iterate from cell A2 through to the last cell, and we'll move 1 row at a time. We're moving across the rows, which is the first dimension. Next, the inner loop, which for every row moves from the leftmost to the rightmost column. So basically, when we're in the first row, before moving on to the second row, what we will do is move across each column to the right till we hit the rightmost column. So we move A2 to B2 to C2 to D2 all the way to M2, and then we'll come down to A3. This time we're moving across the second dimension, which is the columns. Let's get the position numbers saved in row 4 of the mapping array. Since the column numbers in the input array is the same as the column numbers in the mapping array, the j variable represents the exact same column on both the output and the mapping array. So in other words, the original header has the exact same number columns as the input header. So when we are moving across the columns from left to right, the position of the current column, or basically the variable j, will be the exact same position as of the corresponding column in the mapping array. So when j is in the 4th column in the input array, at the same time, it will be on the 4th column of the mapping array. And because of that, we can capture the value in the 4th row of the current column. So when we are in column 4, which is basically the customer, we will capture the value column 7, and using this logic, we will know to paste the value from the 4th column in the input array to the 7th column of the output array. So let's populate that variable. So we're taking it from the 4th row of the current column. A point to note here is that if the position field is blank, the output header position variable will store it as a 0. So our logic should say that if the position is not 0, then let's fill that column position in the output array with the current value in the input array. So if this variable is not blank, or basically if it's not 0 because we've defined it as a long, then we'll populate the corresponding value in the output array. So we will be in the same row, just the column number is going to change, and that column number is going to be this variable that we have saved right here. And this is equal to the current value of the input array. Okay, I'm going to apologize for this. I can appreciate that this can be difficult to grasp at the first instance. If you have any doubts about this, please let me know in the comment section. I can create more videos where we break up array manipulation even further. Okay, before we move on to the last logic of the groups, let's paste these results onto the output sheet and see what we get. So again, when pasting data from an array, we need to define the entire destination range. So we will paste data beginning from the 2nd row and the 1st cell to the cell that contains the same position value as the total rows in the output array. And because we already have a header in the output sheet, we need to offset this range by 1. So I'm just going to add 1 to it. So this is the bottom row. Now for the total columns, it's basically equal to the same number of columns in the output array. And this range will equal to the output array. Okay, let's run this. Couple of typographical errors I can see out here. So let's change this to in head. Okay, let's run this. I think we need to stop this and run through everything step by step. So just to troubleshoot this, what I'll do is just put a breakpoint out here, run this code. Let's see if my last row and the last column is populating. So last row is 70,000 something. So this code seems to be correct. But when I hover over the last column variable, it gives me the value of 1, which is obviously not correct. So let's go and just quickly check. Yes, the input header has values in it. Okay, silly me. This needs to be the other way around. So we need to find the last column in the 1st row. Okay, let's stop this. Play this again. Let's see what populates. Lcol is now 13 and we have 13 columns in the input header, which is correct. Stop this. I remember using the same formula somewhere else. So let's change this as well because I'm sure that would error out as well. Okay, let's play this and see what error we get. No error. Okay, this is exactly what we want. All the columns in the output sheet have populated as per the translation logic set out in the mapping table. We had no mapping for column B and column C, which are our groups and subgroups. And this is because we're going to grab these values from our group array. And we'll see how to do that in the next step. Okay, I have one more admission to make. The following method may not be the most efficient method. The reason is that to find the group and subgroup, we will iterate again through the output array, find the product code in every row, and then iterate through the group array till we find the same product code. And once we do, we will transfer over the values of the group and subgroup from the group array to the output array. So why is this inefficient? Because to find the group and subgroup, we need to iterate through the entire group array each time. If we just had to find one value, for example, the group, we could have just used a dictionary, which would directly give us the group value without looping through the data each time. However, for the sake of this video, we will stick to arrays, which are still fast, but just not the fastest method for this particular activity. Okay, back to our code. Let's create two variables to hold the product code in each array. Now let's start iterating through the output array. We'll go from the lower bound of the rows, which is dimension 1, to the upper bound. We'll get the product code, which is in the first column. Okay, so this is hard coded and I'm not really comfortable with that. However, this is the output data, and we'll make the assumption that we are going to cater to changes in the input data. So if any of these columns change, we want the user to be able to update the mapping. However, the output data is going to remain constant. This is not a very good assumption, but I'm just going to make this assumption to avoid complicating the code even further. Now that we've got the product code, let's iterate through the group array. And get the product code from that array, which is in the first column as well. So if we find a match, that is if the outProduct variable is equal to the group product variable, then we will copy over the group and subgroup values. So the second field, which is the product group in the output array, will equal to the third column in the grouping array. And similarly, we can assign the value for the subgroup as well. And once we found a match, we don't need to loop over the group array any further for that product code. That is, if raspberry jam was what we were looking for, we can grab jam and spreads. And now that we have these two values, we don't need to iterate through the rest of the group array. So what we will do is use a goto statement and use a line label to go directly to the next iteration of our output array. So we will put a goto out here and go to where, go directly to the next row in the output array. Okay, not done yet. One little bit of error handling is still left. If a product code is present in the output array but hasn't been mapped yet in the group data set, then we will land up iterating through the entire group array without finding a match. So basically this condition will never be met, this line will never get triggered, and we will land up to this part of the code. And if we land here, it means that we do not have a value for the group and subgroup for that particular product code. If that happens, we should assign an unmapped value to both the group and subgroup in the output array. Let's do that. Great. That's the final part of our logic. And I do have one final admission. This last loop could have been done within this loop, so that we would have to loop through the input or output data only once. This would have saved time in case of large data sets. But again, for the sake of simplicity, I've kept these as separate. Now, for the very last part, let's dump this final array onto the output sheet. And we've already done that out here. So we'll just cut this code and paste it at the bottom. Okay, just gonna save this and run this. See what we got. Go to the output sheet. Great, we can see the group and the subgroup being populated. Now let's test the same scenarios as what we did in the demo. What we'll do out here is just change this data set. So in the demo, we had added a column before product. Out here, let's add a column out here. Just going to call this random date. Assign it to some value. Okay, so in this case, we would expect a mismatch error on the column random date. Let's run the code and see what we get. Great, we get the mismatch error. And how do we fix this? Well, we don't want to go into the code and fix this because all the mapping is actually present on our mapping sheet. What we need to do is cut and paste this over, add the random date heading into our data set here. Just fill this column range. Okay, and that's it. Let's run this code. Come to the output sheet. We did not get an error. All the data was pasted in the right columns. So that's pretty much exactly what we want. Now to the next error scenario. This is when we have an unmapped product code. So let's change the mapping out here. Change raspberry jam to gherkin relish. Run the code. We will not get any error message. However, we would expect the 11th line to have unmapped values in the product group and the product subgroup columns. 11th line, and we have unmapped here and unmapped there. Oh, I can see we hadn't changed the spicy relish from the demo walkthrough. So let's change these both. Come to our grouping, add spicy relish, add gherkin relish. Okay, we'll call these both as relishes. So that completes the mapping. Let's run this. And we should not have any unmapped errors now. Come to output sheet. Yep, no more unmapped errors. So great, that's the end of our code. Let's move on to the wrap up. And that's the video. Hopefully, the explanation was clear enough to inspire you to start using arrays when manipulating data. If you need more examples with array manipulations, please let me know in the comments below. But with arrays, honestly, the overall efficiency of your macro will go through the roof. And the more you start using arrays, the easier it will become. Hopefully you've enjoyed this presentation and it has provided you some new ideas or new possibilities. If this video has added some value, please do consider subscribing. Great, thanks and see you in the next video.